My name is Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. Thank you for having an interest in this critically important topic of vaccines, and welcome to the video, Vaccination, What the CDC Documents and Science Reveal. When it comes to the topic of vaccines, most people have an existing belief that vaccines are essential for the health of individuals and for the betterment of society. We believe that vaccines are safe, we trust that they are effective, and we are confident that they will protect our children from deadly infectious diseases. These beliefs have been presented to us as facts, and we accept that they are true. As a result, we unquestioningly submit to vaccines for our children and for ourselves. It never occurs to us to challenge these beliefs or to question whether these premises are true. The tape you are about to see contains material that will challenge those beliefs. It is important for you to know that the information comes directly from scientific journals and from the Centers for Disease Control, the nation's top administrative authority in the area of health. It is the CDC that has jurisdiction over our lives when it makes decisions to mandate vaccines. It is within the CDC's documents that we will find information rarely discussed in the public regarding the truth about vaccines. Statistics have shown that when presented with a new, different, challenging idea, 96% of people will spend all of their time and energy defending their current beliefs, and only 4% will embrace the idea as something to seriously consider. Since you are taking the time to investigate this important issue, I'm confident that you are part of the 4%. It is my sincere hope that you will gain the additional knowledge that you need to make truly informed decisions regarding vaccination, one of the most important decisions you will ever make regarding the health of your family and your own health. Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I want to tell the people who are watching the video, thank you for watching the video, and we are recording this morning in front of a live studio audience. And what we're going to be talking about today is called Vaccination, What the CDC Documents and Science Reveal. Now, when you start talking about vaccination, it's a very large topic. There are many vaccines, and there's also the politics of vaccination, there's the big money about vaccination, there's vaccine injury, there's vaccine promotion, there's vaccine dissent. So there's a whole big area of vaccination to talk about. What we're going to talk about today really has to do with the science and what I've discovered through about 4,000 hours worth of research. Well, how the heck did I get interested in vaccination? Because who I am is a classically trained physician. I'm board certified in emergency medicine. I practiced in emergency department for 12 years, and not only was I an emergency room physician, I was the director of the ER and president of our ER corporation, and I ran a 3-county EMS, and I set up a 3-county mental health transportation system that involved the sheriff's department, the police department, and the state highway patrol. So not only did I do every conventional thing that you can imagine in terms of conventional medicine, but when I was an ER doc, I used to hand out tetanus shots like they were some special form of candy. Have people been waiting there for 2 hours because they'd cut their finger washing dishes? I wasn't going to take the time to go and explain to them that they just had a tetanus shot 3 years ago and they probably didn't need it. I just thought it was something totally benign, a little bit of tetanus toxoid and a little saline, and we'd get them their shot and out the door they went. So how did I get from point A to point B? Because I was obviously way into conventional medicine. Well, in 1994, my business partner and colleague and very dear friend, Dr. Dave Franczek, died of cancer. And at that point, he was only 33 years old. And my heart sort of went out of emergency medicine, and I thought that there might be a whole lot more to treating people than just patching them up in the ER. And I come from a whole lineage of chiropractors, 3 generations as a matter of fact, with my grandfather and my father and 3 uncles and 2 cousins as chiropractors. I really wanted to get back to my osteopathic roots and do more in terms of healing people and getting people well rather than just patching people up. So I started an office practice, and I did the office practice doing osteopathic manipulation and acupuncture 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I worked in the ER Tuesday, Thursday, and every other weekend. So it was a rather schizophrenic life and very busy, and I did that for a couple of years. And finally one day I said, whoa, what's wrong with this picture? I'm this divorced professional female with no children, living in a married with kids kind of town, working 100 hours a week, and this is getting me nowhere. And if I stayed here another 10 years, how much would that change? Well, it really wasn't going to change a whole lot. So I was getting more and more and more involved in the alternative medicine side of my practice because of the office practice, because people would come in and want helps with their vitamins and supplements and diet and herbs, and they wanted more things than just a prescription to try to make them feel better. So at that point I moved to Cleveland and I started OsteoMed 2, and at that time, it was just myself and an office manager. And since then, we've grown to about 16 people, and we're just continuing to expand and grow. Well, it was in September of 2000, I had the opportunity to attend the National Vaccine Information Center meeting in Washington, D.C. And at that point, I went in and I sat for 4 days listening to a meeting, and I just couldn't even believe my ears. I mean, I'm rather an information junkie, and I read a lot and I study a lot, and this whole area of medicine was totally new to me. How did I miss this? Well, it just became such a fascination for me because I thought, well, if all these people standing up here with big credentials and really seem to be very knowledgeable are speaking out against vaccines, maybe that's something that I ought to take a look at. So figuring that the best defense is a good offense, I thought that the best place to start was to go to the CDC. Now the CDC is the Center for Disease Control, and they are what we would call the highest law in the land when it comes to vaccines. Sort of like if you were an attorney and you were investigating and researching a court case, you would want to see what the Supreme Court said about it. You would want to go to the highest law in the land. So when I started going to the CDC documents, I decided that I didn't really have to look many other places because there was so much information in there that was not known to doctors, not known to the general public, and really showed that vaccines did cause a lot of damage and that there was a real reason for concern. So after about the last 3 years of just spending all of my extra time, I mean, my friends who know me say, you know, you have no life, because I spend all my evenings reading CDC documents. And so I do that because I'm very passionate about this topic. I believe that we really need to know more about this. I'm very passionate about the vaccine-injured children that we treat in our clinic, and I'm very passionate to do something to get the information out to stop the tide of what's happening in this country in terms of vaccine injury. So we're going to talk about that. We need to find out what the CDC actually really says about vaccines. And what they say is that vaccines are among the nation's most important public health tools. They save lives and money, protect people, and particularly infants and young children, from unnecessary suffering caused by vaccine-preventable diseases, and improve the quality of life for infants, children, adolescents, and adults. Since the introduction of safe and effective vaccines, the United States and most developed countries have experienced at least a 97% reduction in the number of cases of vaccine-preventable diseases of childhood compared to pre-vaccination era. Reported cases of vaccine-preventable diseases in children are at currently record low levels. However, these diseases can readily return if immunization levels decline as a result of complacency or other factors. And I always like to say the other factors are informed people. They're informed people who decide that maybe that really isn't the complete truth. And this whole area here, where we talk about each one of these individual things, I do a 2-day, 14-hour seminar that is a background information on each of the individual vaccines. And when we do, so we spend 14 hours doing this topic, we take each one of these things apart line item and show that there's another side of the story than what you're being told by conventional doctors. Which brings about another point is when people come up to me and say, "Hey, Sherry, what can you tell me about vaccines?" I kind of chuckle and say, we better narrow that down a little bit or we're going to be here a really long time. The other thing that they say about vaccine people who decide they want to get informed is that they're an anti-something. They're an anti-vaccine consumer, and they tend to be those with a child who had a bad reaction, which of course could have been a coincidence, and those who believe that the government should not tell them what to do, and those who are increasingly focused on the perceived benefits of alternative medicine. Well, since I've been doing alternative medicine in my practice for 7 years, I know that there's more than just perceived benefits, and I know that some of you here can feel the same way. And this person here, this Dr. Bruce Gellin, is the head of the Vaccine Initiative Pediatric Infectious Disease Society, and this came out in 1999. And I want to tell you that that's pretty much the thinking of the way conventional doctors think about people. It's not that you are a pro-choice consumer. It's not that you want to be informed. It's that you're an anti-something. So I think one of the things that's really important, and I think it's really important to understand early on, is the difference of in a definition. The definition difference between vaccination and immunization, because they're not the same thing. So when you hear people saying that they're going to take their kids to the doctor to get their immunizations, they're really not. What they're really doing is they're taking them to get vaccinated, because what vaccination means, it's a physical act of administering a vaccine. It means going to get a shot. Immunization, on the other hand, means the process of trying to induce artificial immunity. So they're really different. And not only are they different conceptually, even the CDC says that although persons often use vaccination and immunization interchangeably, the terms are not synonymous. the administration of a vaccine, which is what they call an immunobiologic, cannot be automatically equated with the development of immunity. So just because you get a shot doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be immune. Just because you get a shot doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have an antibody, and just because you have an antibody doesn't mean it's going to protect you from disease. And we're going to talk about that a lot more in depth as time goes on. Now, one thing I just want to point out here is you'll see as we go through these slides, you'll see these citations down here at the bottom that start with MMWR. That stands for Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. Those are CDC documents that come out every week that talk about various types of disease processes and infectious processes. So every time you see MMWR in any of these slides, you know that that comes directly from a government document. So we've got a really big public health policy here. We've got laws in every state. Now we've got this national umbrella called the Homeland Security Bill that we can ratchet up vaccination, mandatory vaccination to a federal level. We have to have some reason to do this. We have to have some policies behind this. Well, the first one is that vaccines are safe. And it doesn't matter what you read in the public press, if you're reading in the New York Times, if you're reading in some medical journal, that's almost one of the first things that you hear, is the vaccines are safe, and right behind that vaccines are effective and the effects are long-lasting. Vaccine benefits include the decline of infectious diseases, and that vaccines are the only way to prevent epidemics of those dangerous diseases like mumps and chickenpox. Okay, so these are like the public health policy. This is the cornerstone upon which we have formulated our entire public health policy. So we're going to go through today and look at each one of these things and show you that there's another side to this that you may not know. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about today is the design of a safety study, because a safety study is the cornerstone upon which everybody says that vaccines are safe. So what is a safety study? Well, it's really not what you think. Because in the design of a safety study, the way it should be designed is a true safety study. You should take a new vaccine and compare it to an inert substance, something like saline or sterile water. But what happens instead is that you get a new vaccine and you compare it to a second vaccine of a known safety profile. Now, when you talk to your family practice doctor, you talk to your pediatrician about that, I can guarantee you he doesn't know that, or she doesn't know that. And I've had several meetings recently with doctors, and I've said that to them. I said, you know, when they bring a new drug to market, like a new anti-inflammatory, a new antidepressant, they take that drug and they really truly compare it to a sugar pill, to a placebo, and see what happens. When they do a new vaccine, they compare a new vaccine to an old vaccine with an existing profile, and they are really pretty shocked by that. This all started way back when the Institute of Medicine approved the use of looking at a pertussis vaccine versus a rubella vaccine to see if the side effect profiles were the same. So this started back in the early 1990s, and it actually started way back even during the polio trials, but we won't get into that today. The other thing that happens is that safety studies only include healthy children, and that even though after the safety study is completed, the vaccine will be approved to use in all children. And this is an example that came from the Pediatric Infectious Disease Journal that said when they were designing this study that the potential subjects that were excluded had neurological disease, seizures, autoimmune functions such as HIV. But once this vaccine has been approved and it's been put into the pediatric schedule, any child will be able to get it and will most likely be recommended to get it, because they would say that the risk of getting the infection in immunocompromised children is worse than the possibility of getting the disease, or than getting the infection. So what ends up happening with that is that on the very large scale, when they do studies, they do somewhere between 800 or 2,000 or even 20,000 kids. But when they start vaccinating on a mass vaccination scale, those children become the test subjects. Because what they actually say in the CDC documents is that the test studies and the trials aren't large enough to be able to define all the possible side effects. The other thing that happens is that serious side effects can be negated simply with the stroke of a pen. And here's two examples that I'm going to read to you a little bit out of a study, because I think that this makes a very big, important point, is that when safety studies are designed, if the conclusions are not in line with if there's any data that's not in line with the conclusions, then what ends up happening is that it's just negated. So here's a study that they used 882 healthy infants, there's that healthy infant part again, to compare Comvax, a new vaccine that had the Hib and the hepatitis B in it. They gave them to one, and then the other ones they gave the Hib and the hepatitis B in 2 separate shots. So they're comparing a new combination vaccine in one vial compared to 2 separate shots. That's what's considered the design of the safety study. As they go through this, that there were, during the study, there were 17 children, or nearly 2%, that had events within 14 days of vaccination that met the defining criteria of a serious adverse experience. These included seizure, diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration, bronchiolitis, tachypnea, which is really rapid breathing, pneumonia, reflux esophagitis, and vitreous hemorrhage, which is bleeding in the back of the eye. Virtually all of these experiences were classified as serious because they involved hospitalization. None was judged by the study investigators to be caused by the vaccine. So at the end of the study, up here at the beginning, where it says is the results, there were no serious adverse experiences attributed to the vaccine people in the study, and none were attributed to the vaccine. So just by the stroke of a pen, they can decide that all of those side effects that happened had nothing to do with the vaccine. There's another study just to show you that this happens repeatedly, and all of the studies are like this. Here's another one that they compared 2 different hepatitis B vaccines. And they did it on healthy infants. And during phases of the study, people were excluded that had seizure disorders. And during the course of the study, that several children had SIDS, and several people were found to have seizure disorders. However, none were found by the study investigators to have anything to do with the vaccine. So the conclusion of the study is that both vaccines were safe and effective, and they induced antibodies. So just by the stroke of a pen, they can knock out whatever they don't want to apply. So this is a summary of what I just said, because that was kind of complicated, so I want you to get what I'm really trying to tell you here, is that the new vaccine was compared to the other vaccine, and that was considered the placebo. One of the cornerstones of medicine is double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. That's the science upon which our entire industry builds its consensus. Well, the placebo here is another vaccine. Only healthy infants are enrolled. So after the vaccine is approved, it's given to all of them. And that serious events were negated by the stroke of a pen. And what was actually said in both of those studies is that none was judged by the investigators to be related to vaccination, which always brings up a really important question. Why is it whenever there's a side effect or a complication, it's never the fault of the vaccine? The conclusion? Well, the vaccine is safe and effective. And I can tell you that most people, most doctors, when they read these studies, they don't read the whole study. They don't have time to read the whole study. They read the title, they read the objective, and they read the conclusion. And the conclusion says that the vaccine was safe and effective. That's all they bother to read. So the conclusions about safety is that when you start with a flawed premise, you can't have a valid conclusion. And therefore, vaccines really have not been proven to be safe. So we've looked at this part of our public health policy in terms of vaccines and safety. Well, let's move on to the second portion, which is vaccines are effective and the effects are long-lasting. What's the meaning of efficacy? That's kind of a big doctor kind of word, and we throw that word around a lot. So what does that really mean? Well, again, it's not exactly what you think. The Webster's definition of efficacy is the power to produce intended results. So we want to do something, and if we get that result, then we consider whatever we did to be effective. Well, when I started going through and reading all these vaccine studies, and I've read hundreds, I guess, over the course of the last couple of years, I came to the conclusion that this definition of efficacy is kind of slippery business, because it's kind of like vaccination and immunization. There's 2 separate definitions of efficacy. There's research efficacy, which means I give you a shot and you developed an antibody. But then there's clinical efficacy, which means the ability to prevent infection. And I truly believe that most physicians, when they read vaccine studies or when they use the word efficacy, when they say that vaccines are safe and effective, what they're thinking in their mind is that means that when you get a vaccine, it will effectively protect you from the infection. So they're thinking about the clinical efficacy, not the fact that what the science is really looking at, what these studies are really looking at, is whether or not you've developed an antibody response. So the science is based on research efficacy, not clinical efficacy. Well, is that just my thinking? Did I just make that up? Well, I think not, because when you go through and read some of the things about the individual vaccines, I think you'll be surprised. What it says about the chickenpox vaccine, that no data exists regarding post-exposure efficacy of the varicella vaccine, which means if you get the vaccine after you've been exposed, we don't know if it's going to help you or not, because if you're exposed, you already have an antibody. And the relative contribution of immune response to protection from the chickenpox vaccine is unknown. And there is insufficient data to assess the rate of protection against the complication of chickenpox, encephalitis, hepatitis, and pneumonia in children. So what is the main reason why they tell you need to get the chickenpox vaccine is so that you don't end up with these terrible complications. But the Merck, who makes the stuff, says, well, we don't really know whether or not the chickenpox vaccine protects you from those serious complications. All we do know is that if you get a shot, you get an antibody. That part we know. Well, what about pertussis? The findings of efficacy studies have not demonstrated a direct correlation between antibody response and the protection against pertussis disease. So you get an antibody, what does it mean? Well, it's effective. We gave you a vaccine and it's research effective. You got the antibody, but it's not necessarily clinically effective. What about the Hib, or the H flu, which is a bacteria that can cause ear infections, pneumonia, or meningitis? The antibody contribution to clinical protection is unknown. We don't know if you get that antibody if it's going to clinically protect you or not. And the precise level of antibody required for protecting against invasive disease, we don't know that one either. So we know that when we give you a shot, you develop an antibody, but we really don't know whether you get that antibody if it's going to do anything for you or not. And what about smallpox? And this came from a JAMA article back in 1999. And it said that neutralizing antibodies are reported to reflect levels of protection, although this has not been validated in the field. So you can get antibodies, but we really don't know if this is going to protect you or not. And this came from a research interview from Dr. John March from the Morden Research Institute in Scotland, where they do a lot of investigation in animal studies, primarily with vaccines in animals. And what he said in that interview was, particularly for viral diseases, the cellular immune response is most important, and antibody levels and protection are totally unconnected. So this is something that we kind of know, but it's not anything that we put into practice. We really do believe that effective means clinical protection, and those two things, just like vaccination and immunization aren't synonyms, neither are vaccination and antibody production synonymous with protection. So conclusions regarding efficacy is that vaccines effectively induce the production of antibodies. That we do know, and that's what they're actually looking for when they're doing the research studies. And if this is the intended results, then it is correct for the CDC to declare that vaccines are effective. We do get an antibody. Vaccines have not really been proven to be clinically effective. And if protection from disease is the intended result, then the CDC's message is at best incorrect and at worst deceptive. So we've talked about safety and we've talked about efficacy. Now let's talk about the benefits of where vaccines have really contributed to the decline of infectious diseases. And what always comes up is this one. And it always comes up repeatedly, and when I do the 2-day seminar, we spend an hour of that first seminar just talking about smallpox and polio. Because that's where everybody goes with this. Well, didn't vaccines totally eradicate smallpox? And didn't vaccines totally eradicate polio? And if that's the truth, then if we continue to vaccinate for everything, we should be able to eradicate everything. Okay? But that's really not the truth. In fact, mass vaccination had been going on worldwide since about the 1800s. The first smallpox vaccination was in this country, it was in South Carolina in 1801. So we've been doing smallpox vaccines for a long time. And it was halted in the third world countries because it really wasn't working as planned. If we'd been doing all these mass vaccination campaigns all around the world, by this time we should have eradicated smallpox. And here is an example. The outbreaks were still occurring in India as recently as the late 1960s, even though they had a vaccination rate of 88%. So in 1972, the World Health Organization changed their strategy. They said, well, this isn't working and this is costing us an awful lot of money. Maybe we ought to try something different. So they started something called surveillance and containment. What that meant was that they would go out into the little villages and they would actively seek out people with smallpox, isolate them or quarantine them in their homes. They would do ring vaccination around the close, immediate personal contacts that were there with them. And when they did that, outbreaks of smallpox stopped occurring within 4 years, and we had reached the point of eradication within 7 years. So the mass vaccination wasn't really working. It was something that they did different, called quarantine. And here's a chart that shows really fairly graphically what I just talked about. This is the number of countries reporting cases of smallpox. In 1950, there were roughly 82. By 1967, that had cut in half during that length of time. And that was when they started their eradication program. And it wasn't till here when they started with the surveillance and containment plan. Now, people could say, well, maybe smallpox vaccine was really working. Maybe the reason that these countries were coming down to here was because we kept vaccinating everybody all around the world, and maybe there was something to that. And maybe this was we just accentuated it here. Well, one of the people who was very much involved with this eradication program back in the 1970s was a Dr. Tom Mack, and we're going to talk about that for a minute. Because what the CDC might say about this graph is that what really stopped it, what really made smallpox eventually go away, was that ring vaccination. But the truth of the matter is there's a little different premise here, is that since the infection ran its course in 3 to 6 weeks, perhaps isolation or quarantine would have been done just as well. Because we know since the Middle Ages, when they had the plague and things like that, that we know that quarantine works in terms of stopping the spread of infectious diseases. And Dr. Tom Mack from the University of Southern California, Tom's probably, I'm going to guess he's in his late 60s, maybe early 70s, was at the CDC meeting when I went to Atlanta in June of this year, June of last year, and testified at the CDC. I had the opportunity to go twice to testify at the CDC last summer, once in St. Louis and once in Atlanta, to speak out against the mandatory mass vaccination campaign that at that point in time was really brewing on the horizon. And one of the presenters there was Dr. Tom Mack. And I spoke to him after the meeting was over because some of the things he said were quite startling. Now keep in mind that this is one of the physicians who was very much involved in the smallpox mass vaccination campaigns back through the 70s. He qualifies himself by saying that he personally has seen more cases of smallpox than probably anyone in the world. He was involved in somewhere up to 120 mass vaccination campaigns. I mean, he was around a lot of this, spent a lot of time in Pakistan and India. And what he actually said was that the case fatality rate in adults was much lower than was generally advertised and was closer to 10 to 15%. Now, what do we hear on the news all the time? 30%, 40%, maybe more, maybe everybody. But what he said that actually it was between 10 and 15%, and that the statistics were loaded with children, and that the children that got smallpox probably died at a much higher rate, between 50 and 60%. But think about where they were. They were in third world countries, malnourished, close living quarters, not good health, not good hygiene. So it would make sense that children would have a higher death rate in those sort of living conditions. The other thing he said that was quite amazing was that he said, even without mass vaccination, smallpox would have died out anyway, it just would have taken a little bit longer. So by his own admission, who's one of the granddaddy people involved with all of this, he said it really wasn't smallpox vaccine. We really know it was the elevation of education, of health, of better hygiene, of better food, people would live in their own homes. They didn't have the close living quarters anymore. So what happens if you really do get smallpox? And I think it's important to spend a little time talking about this because we are in a place of being concerned about it. It's in our popular press all the time. Well, smallpox is actually a skin infection and a rash that begins on the face and the forearms 3 to 17 days after exposure. It's just like if you send your kids to school and there's a whole bunch of kids in the class that have colds. Doesn't mean everybody's going to catch it. Well, it's the same thing with smallpox. They become vesicles that starts out looking a little bit like chicken pox, and that was one of the big discussions, was whether or not they would be misinterpreted early on as smallpox versus chicken pox. Starts out with little vesicles, little water blisters, and over time it turns into pustules, and then pustules become embedded in the skin and get knots and bumpy skins, and over time then ends up with scarring. And it's the scarring that's characteristic from healing. Internal organs are seldom involved, and this comes from old Merck manuals of people that used to have a lot of smallpox, and we used to see smallpox. In fact, smallpox, the last case of smallpox in this country was in Texas in 1949. So what did people die from? If internal organs weren't really involved, and we keep saying there was a 30% death rate, what did they really die from? Well, before I went to give my testimony in Atlanta and in St. Louis, I spent several days doing intense research in new textbooks, old Merck manuals, calling old libraries. I did an incredible amount of research to say, what was the cause of death from smallpox? I couldn't find anything. So I thought, well, isn't that just interesting? I mean, I think that the healthcare in our country has advanced quite a bit since 1949. And so if we are saying we have a 30% death rate based on 1949 healthcare or before, maybe something's not quite right about this. So twice at the CDC, in part of my little statement and testimony, I said, does anyone know what the cause of death of smallpox was? Well, the first time they said, well, you know, maybe it was immune complex deposition, which means there was an autoimmune reaction that went on and caused kidney failure, but they didn't really know. When I testified at the CDC in Atlanta, nobody really knew. Kathy Williams took that, who's head of the National Vaccine Information Center, took that question to the Institute of Medicine. They didn't know. So after I testified in Atlanta, another 45 minutes to an hour went by, and the ACIP panel is a panel of probably about 30 or 40 people. It's a big group of people. And one of the people that was sitting on the panel said, I have a question. Somebody asked a really interesting question about what was the cause of death of smallpox. Does anybody know the answer to that? I'd kind of like to know. Well, what ended up happening was that they said, well, they really didn't know. But Dr. D.A. Henderson, who is truly the granddaddy of them all, sauntered up to the microphone and said, well, it's a mystery. We really don't know. We had one of our fellows do a big research and look through all of the old documents and all of the old historical things, and we really don't know. We figured some people died of malnutrition, some people died from the vaccine, some people died from immune complex, which is an autoimmune reaction. Some may have had secondary skin infections, but that percentage was really, really low. But we really, really don't know. So what came out of that then was another paper that presented looking at all of the possibilities of what could possibly cause the smallpox death. And it's projected now that if we had a massive smallpox outbreak now, that the death rate would be somewhere between 1% and 2%. Now, we don't hear any of that on the news, but that was all at the ACIP meeting. Now, the new Vaccinia vaccine that they're coming out with, it's really not the new smallpox vaccine. It's not cowpox. Because everybody says, well, you know, we got all those vaccines when we were kids and we had what was that? Well, that was cowpox. This one isn't. This one is Vaccinia. It's a genetically engineerable virus. And Dr. Koritsky from the CDC made a really big point of saying this is not cowpox. It's thought to be made somewhere from extinct horsepox, but it's genetically engineered, and they really don't have a real good answer for that. The problem with Vaccinia is that it can be genetically engineered to be combined with all other types of viruses, and to date it's been combined with herpes, rabies, hepatitis B, influenza, and HIV. And this paper came out June 20th, 2001. Let me see, that's 3 months before September 11th, 2001, that they posted this paper on the appropriate use of the smallpox vaccine, which I just found that quite interesting. And when I actually read the paper and I saw this, I called the CDC, and I call them a lot. I mean, they're really nice people. I mean, they really are. They're very nice, and they're very helpful. And I said, I'm just reading your paper here about the smallpox vaccine, and you've got all of these things that are potentially combined with them that are in research. So if I get a smallpox vaccine, which one do I know that I'm getting? And they said, well, this is what we're trying to do with this is we're trying to create a super vaccine. We're trying to put these all into one vaccine, so when you get this, you get it all at one time, you get all this protection. I said, well, what if I don't want the super vaccine? She said, well, this is all kind of experimental right now, but I just share this with you to say that this is where this is going. And because what we consider the smallpox vaccine that's currently under development is considered to be a national security risk to tell anybody what's really in it, we really don't know. So what are the potential side effects? Well, it's been estimated that if 1 million people were vaccinated today, that as many as 250 would experience a severe reaction. When you do the math on that, that's 1 in 4,000, which is a whole lot lower than any of the vaccine statements that you get for the VIS statements, the vaccine safety statements that you get with the childhood vaccines, that they say 1 in a million, 1 in 2 million, and what we hear in the news in terms of 1 or 2 million people might die. Well, how deadly is smallpox? I mean, really, really. Well, this comes from, again, the CDC, that in 1900, there were 21,000 cases of smallpox and 894 people died. Well, we don't know if those 894 were vaccinated or unvaccinated. We don't know if they had other underlying health conditions that were going on, like maybe they had asthma or allergies, or maybe they had other types of autoimmune diseases, maybe they had heart disease. We really don't know. We just know that on their death certificate, it recorded the cause of death was smallpox in 894 people. When you do the math on that, that's 4.2%. And so that was as recently as 1900. So all of this hype about the 30% death rate is kind of hype. And it's not even based in data based on their own data. And so one of the things that I talked to, when I talked to Dr. Orenstein at the CDC, I took him aside and I said, well, if this is really true, let's assume that it's really a true fact, that smallpox has a 30% death rate. Doesn't that mean it's got a 70% survival rate? And if you were a betting person, wouldn't you bet on that side of the equation? Well, not really. He just really thought that everybody really needed to be vaccinated. So a more rational approach about this whole idea of smallpox is that you monitor people. If there's an exposure, let's say that you were down at the Cleveland Browns Stadium and they thought that there was some sort of a smallpox exposure. You quarantine people. You put them in a room and you watch them. Because just like getting a cold, not everybody that's going to be exposed to it is going to catch it. And the average incubation period is up to 14 days. So if you develop a fever within that period of time, it might be suggestive that maybe you're getting smallpox. You could be just getting the flu. You don't really know. And that even if you do start to break out into smallpox, if you get the pustules or the vesicles or things like that, people are not contagious until they have full-blown smallpox, they have pustules all over their body, and that even then it would be very hard to spread smallpox because the CDC says that smallpox is spread by close personal contact for a minimum of 6 to 7 days. So if you were in the same house with somebody that had that in close personal contact for 6 to 7 days, think about how smallpox was passed in third world countries. Close personal contact that people all lived together, slept together, ate together. Well, it doesn't happen in America. So even at that, if at that point in time you wanted to do ring vaccination, if you really felt that that would stop or at least minimize the infection that you would get, you have up to 4 days after the person starts breaking out in the infection to become vaccinated. So vaccine can be delayed. So all of this stuff, to push all this stuff out into the general market, really isn't backed up by science. And the problem is going to be is that if there's one case in Key West, we're going to have to they're going to force mandatory vaccination across the entire country. And what Dr. Tom Mack's article, and I would encourage all of you to get this article, it's the New England Journal of Medicine, January 30th, 2003 issue. He does a very good review in there that talks about the fact that if there was a very large outbreak of smallpox, that the death rate, by his estimation, would be somewhere between 20 and 30 people. And that mass vaccination would, at a minimum, kill between 2,000 and 3,000 people. So the risk-benefit ratio there is way off. And I want to give you one little quick update on the smallpox. As of December 13th of 2002, President Bush had issued a mandate to start vaccinating the military, and he wanted 500,000 civilian volunteers. Well, as of February 21st, just a couple of weeks ago, only 7,354 people had volunteered for the smallpox vaccination program. There were more than 108,000 military personnel that have been vaccinated in the last 6 weeks. 6 had serious complications, 2 cases of encephalitis, 2 serious rashes, 1 case of myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart muscle, and an eye infection, which Vicinia in the eye can cause blindness. So that wasn't just some benign little thing that they talked about in the media. And that up to 3% of the military people missed an average of 1.5 days of work. That's 3,240 people that were sick. Now, we know that part of the vaccine program problem is that they haven't made any accommodations. If they wanted to vaccinate all those nurses and all those nurses got sick, what were we going to do about it? That's a lot of people. And this came just recently, just 2 days ago from the Washington Post. Okay, well, what about polio? Because we said, well, maybe vaccine really didn't eradicate smallpox, didn't really do anything with polio. Well, I don't have time to go into as much detail with polio as I did with smallpox. We just don't have the time for that today. But I want to say that, because I wanted to spend a little more time with smallpox because it's so timely right now and it's in our news and it's something that I feel that people should know about. But this is kind of the background of what was happening with polio. The top line is what was happening in Great Britain. The bottom line is what was happening in the United States in terms of the percentage decrease of reported cases of polio between 1920 and when we started vaccinating. Here we started vaccinating with the Salk vaccine, and here was the Sabin vaccine. So polio was kind of on its way out before the vaccine came into play also. And this is kind of a busy slide, and what this is the incidence of polio in Canada between 1927 and 1962. There were some little spikes that we had in here. This is 1953. Now these are the total number of cases of reported polio. That was both paralytic polio, that was the unilateral polio that went away in 24 hours. It was every type of paralysis that they were reporting. The vaccine didn't come into play till 1955, and for the trials in 1956 is when we started vaccinating. Clear out here is when we started using the Sabin vaccine, and these number of cases here, where it looks like, well, gee, the incident went way down. Well, these are the total number of cases. What's here is just the paralytic cases, just the ones that were paralyzed. So the number was really extraordinarily small before the vaccine even became into play. So what about measles? Now when you go to the doctor and the doctor says you need to get the MMR, why do they say you need to get the measles vaccine particularly? Well, because if your child gets measles, they're going to die, right? Isn't that always what, well, they're going to get encephalitis and they're going to die uniformly if they get it. Well, what actually is the truth is that in 1920 there were 469,000 cases of measles with a 1.6% death rate. Now again, we don't know why those people actually died. That was on their death certificate, that was reported to the CDC, but we don't know what underlying health problems that they may have had that may have contributed to that. Then we went to 1955, when the death rate had dropped to 3 in 10 million. The death rate from measles was 3 in 10 million, 8 years before we started vaccinating with the measles vaccine. So yes, when measles vaccine came out, we were still having outbreaks of measles. We were. People weren't dying from it anymore. They weren't. And the reason that they say we have to get the measles vaccine is because if you get measles, you're going to die. Well, they'd pretty much stopped dying from measles 8 years before the vaccine went into use. And this is just a graph that sort of puts what I was saying into a graphic form. This was in England and Wales, that the number of cases were falling off. This is 1900 to 1960 is in here. So it had dropped way down before we ever started using vaccines in the UK in 1965. So the conclusion is that the CDC's stated benefits from vaccine is the decline of infectious diseases. But the truth is that most of the infectious diseases had started to decline prior to the fact of when they were ever used. Now we did have some further decrease, but was that really due to the vaccine or was it due to other things that were happening? We really don't know. And when you go to the World Health Organization website, and it talks about the 10 greatest achievements in history and decreasing the rates of infectious disease and the death rate worldwide over the last 100 years, vaccines aren't even in the top 10, which I think is pretty interesting. Now, what about the other benefits from vaccines stated by the CDC? What they say on their website is that there's personal benefits that range from protection against symptomatic illness, they improve your quality of life, and they prevent death. They also say that there are society benefits from this, and that includes herd immunity, prevention of outbreaks, reduction of health care costs, and the maintenance of productivity. So now what we're looking at is how we can keep people healthy so we can keep them working. And whenever you read any of the new studies that have come out, there's always a cost-benefit analysis in terms of dollars and cents, but never really a cost-benefit analysis in terms of the cost to people who are getting the vaccines. So the recommendations for immunization practices balance scientific evidence of benefits. I haven't seen any yet. And each person in the society against potential costs and risks of vaccination programs. And this is a pretty recent paper. This is from February of 2002. So this is where the new paper is coming out saying that we really have to look at the costs of the program in terms of dollar cost and productivity cost, not really costs to the individual. So the CDC calls them personal benefits. We're going to call them medical myths. And we're going to go through each one of them and sort of talk about those. And the first medical myth we're going to talk about is vaccines offer protection from illnesses. What about vaccines that cause illnesses? And I think that this one is pretty dramatic. For starters, there are at least 6 vaccines that have as their side effects listed on the package inserts ear infections. So we have rubella, mumps, hepatitis B, DPT, Hib, Prevnar, chickenpox, and MMR. That just about covers it. It's everything but polio. Now think about this in terms of what happens to our children. They're born happy little critters. At 2, 4, and 6 months, we take them in for their shots. 2, 4, and 6 months. When they start getting their ear infections, about 8 months, 10 months, 12 months, they start getting ear infections. They start getting more and more rounds of antibiotics, which tears up their gut, which decreases their immune system by the time. So then they've got 3 or 4 rounds of that, and they've got their gut all torn up because the doctors generally don't say things like use acidophilus and take them off of dairy and all the other things that might help with decreasing the ear infections. So by the time they are a year of age and they go in and they get that MMR that we know causes gut disruption, and we know from science that measles deplete the vitamin A and do all sorts of things inside the gut, they've already had their gut pretty much trashed by all the antibiotics they've had from all the ear infections. And that maybe some of the ear infections that they were getting was because of the vaccines that they were getting. So let's just look specifically at the pertussis vaccine. What is a pertussis infection? Well, it's a bacterial infection, and the symptoms are caused by the release of a toxin, a literal toxin from the bacteria. It has a characteristic cough that's worse at night, has a lot of thick mucus, and that's where when the little tiny kids, like 2, 4, and 6 months get it, they really have a hard time breathing because they get all these thick secretions and thick mucus things that they don't have enough air capacity in their lungs to cough out. And the infection can last up to 6 weeks. Well, how serious is this? Well, in this 6-year period of time, between 1990 and 1996, there were a little over 35,000 cases reported. Of those, 32% were hospitalized. Well, if they were little kids, yeah, because we put little sick kids in the hospital, right? Some seizures, pneumonia, seizures, and 2.2% death. Again, we don't know what was the underlying cause that was going on. Was it really just pertussis? Did they have respiratory failure? Did they have heart-lung diseases? Did they have cystic fibrosis? Did they have other sorts of things that made them unable to treat them with their pertussis infection? But when you add up those numbers, it still means that 56% of the total cases that were reported recovered uneventfully. They weren't part of these numbers that were here. So there's a whole bunch of people that just stay home, take their antibiotic, because pertussis is treatable to a certain degree with erythromycin. Lots of fluids, lots of vitamin C, do a lot of sucking and getting the secretions out, and it's miserable. It's terrible. I've talked to a lot of parents their kids have had pertussis, and they just sit up with them and they just suck the stuff out of their lungs and they just sort of do percussion on their back, and they know they're going to be sick for a couple of weeks, but then they get over it. So it continues to occur in all age groups in spite of the fact that we have an 88% vaccination rate currently to date in the U.S. for pertussis. And that even highly vaccinated populations have pertussis outbreaks, and that these are inevitable, reflecting a vaccine protection rate of about 80% and waning immunity with age. So it's only going to protect about 80% of the time. And this communicable disease intelligence report, that's a CDC document. That's their monthly thing that comes out. And here's a couple of examples that says, well, gee, we had fully vaccinated daycare in Israel that had a pertussis outbreak. We had a pertussis outbreak in the highly vaccinated population in the Netherlands, and we had another one in Northwest Australia where all of them were vaccinated. So again, antibody response doesn't necessarily mean protection from disease. And what about the pertussis safety study? Well, the number of children that were included in the DTaP trials was insufficient to estimate the risk of severe reactions. So the experimental group is really the kids that go out into the general population. And then this is really, I think, a very important slide, is that in a 3-year period of time, there were 62 reported deaths from pertussis, mostly in the Hispanic population. Again, think where our Hispanic population is in the United States. Southern, Southwest, not necessarily high income, don't necessarily eat well, live in close association. And in the year 2000, there were 17 reported deaths from pertussis. And when you add that together, that means there were 79 deaths in 4 years. Well, let's compare that to the VAERS data. That in 1998 alone, there were 57 deaths reported to the VAERS data. And what's important about that is that it's estimated that only up to 10% of reactions are reported to the VAERS. Okay, VAERS is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, where anybody can file a report of a severe reaction. And the reaction that can be filed can be anything from a sore arm to a severe reaction to death. And anybody can report it, a parent, a grandparent, a doctor, anybody can report it. And that's why, a lot of people don't know about it. They don't even know that it's available to report. And that's why it's actually estimated by, in this JAMA article from 1993, that somewhere between 1 and 10% of the actual adverse reactions are reported. So that means that potentially in 1998, there could have been as many as 570 deaths, or at least 570 severe reactions that had happened if all of them had been reported. So let's summarize that. There were 79 reported deaths in a 4-year period of time from pertussis infection. But there were 57 actual deaths reported from the vaccine, and there could have been 570 either deaths or severe reactions just in that 1 year alone if they'd have all been reported. So the risk-benefit ratio is something that really needs to come out. People really need to know what these numbers are all about and to see what kind of protection ratio do you get and how severe is the infection compared to the risk of the vaccination. So what about the flu shot? You know, I bring this one out for 2 reasons. First of all, because we've been talking pretty much about kids' vaccines this morning. But influenza, for the most part, up until this year, was an adult vaccine. But as of June of 2002, when I was in Atlanta, they are now recommending the flu vaccine starting at 6 months of age and every year for the rest of their life. And if they're starting it when they're 9 years of age and they hadn't had a vaccine yet, they're recommending a double dose. And there are no thimerosal-free flu vaccines available on the market in any age group. Now, what is the flu? Well, we kind of all know that, and we've sort of had a little flu epidemic going on here in Cleveland in the last couple of weeks. I know we've had a couple people in our office out with that. That it's primarily a respiratory infection with fever, chills, myalgias, which is muscle aches and pains, sore throat, cough, and it's specifically caused by a virus that comes from the influenza family, and that's key. That's absolutely key. Because when you get a flu shot, you get 3 viruses that are from this family. So I want you to keep that in your mind for a second. So the flu vaccine is reported to prevent somewhere between 70 and 90% of infection caused by that specific virus. So you've got some high probabilities going on here, okay? You have to run into that specific virus to get any protection from it. And the vaccine works best in healthy adults. Who do we give the vaccine to generally? The elderly and the infirm, and people with lung diseases, and people who aren't very healthy. That's who we give it to. And that even though the majority of influenza-like illnesses are not caused by the influenza virus, but other viruses, things like rhinoviruses and respiratory syncytial viruses and adenovirus, parainfluenza viruses. All of those other types of viruses can give you the exact same flu that you're trying to protect from if you get the flu shot. The vaccine does not protect you against those viruses. It only is only the viruses from the influenza family. Therefore, many persons vaccinated with the flu vaccine can still get 4 to 6 episodes of influenza-like illnesses during the flu season. So then what's the point? I mean, what's the point of injecting 3 miscellaneous viruses into your body? And we're going to talk about viral contaminants in a few minutes, so keep that in the back of your mind. And you're getting thimerosal, extra mercury in there. So what's the point? When I first read this article, this MMWR report of November of 2001, it was a 3-page article. I encourage all of you to get it and look it up. Because it was just a 3-page report, and what it was actually talking about was during the time that we had the anthrax scare that was going on. So they came out with this paper to sort of say what the difference would be between symptoms of anthrax versus the symptoms of the flu. And when I read this, they all but say in their own language, these are quotes, that it doesn't work. Or it only works under these very specified mechanisms. So it was kind of like, what's the point? I really had to literally read it 4 or 5 times to believe what I was reading. I was really surprised. Okay, so then what about tetanus? Because that's the other big scary one that people talk about. We've gone through smallpox and said, well, probably not the vaccine, or less likely to be the vaccine. Polio, well, we didn't have time to go into it really in depth. And there's 2 books that I actually would recommend. One is called Trial by Fury. I actually have them here with me. One is called Trial by Fury by Aaron Klein. If you can find it, it was published in 1977. It's an excellent book that documents the whole history of the development of the polio vaccine. And then the other one is called Patenting the Sun. It's this one by Jane S. Smith that, again, has a little bit more intel in terms of the science, and she brings in a lot of the documents and things that were developing during that period of time. So if you want some more information, background information that we're not having time to cover today on the polio vaccine, I'd recommend those two books. So we've talked about smallpox and polio and the flu and pertussis. Well, what about tetanus? Because that's kind of a scary one. That's always the other one that people sort of come up with. Well, I want to show you this slide in that the tetanus vaccination status, this was the United States between 1995 and 1997, that there were a total of 124 cases of tetanus that were actually reported. Of those cases, there were 14 deaths, okay? But there were also 16 reported cases of tetanus and people that had 3 or 4 or more shots of the vaccine. So again, developing an antibody response doesn't necessarily protect you. The other thing is that people hear about when they say the word tetanus, I mean, what do you think? You think polio, paralysis, you think tetanus, you think lockjaw, death. And even when I was an emergency room doctor, I mean, the one thing that I always thought about tetanus was if you get people, we really have to over-vaccinate people with the tetanus vaccine because they get tetanus, they're going to die. Just uniformly, it's a 100% fatality rate. Well, actually, when you do the numbers on this, it's 11%. That's a far cry from 100%. Now, 11% isn't insignificant, but again, we don't really know what other underlying things that those people may have had that may have put them at a higher risk of death, because some people didn't die. I mean, some people didn't die. 14 deaths, 124 people lived. Okay? The other thing is that the concept of protection was derived from animal studies, and that the level of serum concentration of the tetanus antibody correlated to the severity of the tetanus, and that there was a threshold that was established of 0.01 micro IUs per ml that was established in guinea pigs, because if the level was lower than that, they had fatal tetanus, but it didn't protect them from clinical tetanus. And so tetanus can't occur despite antibodies. So let me boil that down a little bit for you. What is the very, very best way in all the world to protect from getting tetanus? Good wound hygiene. We've known that since the 40s. You got a big old dirty, awful wound, you scrub it out. I mean, I can remember my dad when I was a kid. You know, he'd get a cut out in the barn or something, he'd go, make it bleed, make it bleed, make it bleed. He'd wash it all out and go pour peroxide on it and all those sorts of things, because you want to get rid of those spores. If you get a really awful, dirty, ground-in sort of, dirty, road rash, fall off a bike or something that you've done in the barn or something like that, at that point, you can actually use another vaccine called tetanus immune globulin, which is the antibody itself. It's sort of like I gave you a tetanus shot and we harvested off the antibodies from you, and that antibody is called tetanus immune globulin. And you can inject that right into the dirty wound site so those antibodies can go in and coagulate with that toxin and kill it off right then. So there are other types of treatments that are available if you've got a dirty wound or if you've got some problems that may be precipitating the potential for tetanus. Because just because you've got a vaccine and that you've got those antibodies floating around doesn't really mean much. And in fact, in this particular study, this is from the British Medical Journal in 2000, they were actually saying that if you've had a tetanus shot, it puts you into a false sense of security because you think that you've had your tetanus shot and you have an antibody level, so you don't do the good wound hygiene and taking care of the wound like you really should. And that there was about 10 or 15 cases, I can't remember the exact number, of people who they had clinical tetanus. They had cephalic tetanus, or they had there's 4 different types of tetanus, and they drew blood levels on them, and they all had more than sufficient antibody levels, and they had the disease anyways. So, just to recap where we are here, pertussis antibodies do not provide protection from pertussis. And the risk from pertussis vaccine appears to be greater than the risk from the infection. And the flu shot really doesn't protect you from getting the flu, and you can still get tetanus even though you're fully vaccinated. So this gives you sort of like the other whole side of the story.